One of the most challenging things about Serger is learning how to find the perfect thread tension. There are 4 threads, so finding which tension to use on which fabric can definitely be a challenge. In this video, I want to share a few tips that finally help me understand and master thread tension on sergers. The tips are going to be very small but very impactful. This video is created in partnership with Brother, and throughout the video you will see me sewing using Brother Airflow 3000 serger. As the name suggests, this serger has air threading, which makes threading looper threads as simple as a push of a button. So now let's begin the tips, and I like to begin the videos with my best tip, and this is the tip that finally made it all click and allow me to understand the thread tension. I call this the opposites rule. So it sounds like this: high tension, less thread in the seam; low tension, more thread in the seam. Sounds very simple, but probably a little bit confusing at first, so I like to provide the visual example of how this rule works. In the first example, let's go ahead and set the first thread tension to 0 and let's sew a seam. Now, tension 0 means that the tension discs are very loose and they allow thread flow very easily into the seam. As a result, because of low tension, we have a lot of thread in the seam, so we see the loops and the seam does not lay flat on the fabric, which shows that with low tension we have a lot of thread in the seam. Now let's do the opposite and let's set the tension on the same needle to the maximum 9 setting and let's sew a seam. Now, because the tension discs are very tight, they're tensing the thread so much that very little thread flows into the seam, and because of that, with high tension we have very little thread in the seam, which causes puckering and creates gathers. So this goes to show that when we're using high tension, we have very little thread in the seam. When we're using low tension, we have a lot of thread in the seam because the tension discs are not tensing the thread and allows it to easily flow into the seam. Now, how to apply this rule practically? When you sew a seam, if you're seeing that the loops are not staying close to the fabric, if you're seeing that the seam is a little bit elevated from the fabric, this means that you have low tension and there's too much thread, so you need to increase the tension. If you're sewing and you start to see that the seam is puckering, the fabric starts to get gathered, this is an indication that the tension is too high, there's too little thread in the seam, and you need to lower the tension. So this opposite rule is what finally made me understand the thread tension on sergers, and when I finally understood this rule, it made finding that perfect tension super simple, and I hope it will make the same for you as well. So this tip was the biggest, most important tip, and the rest of the tips are going to be a little bit more simple. So one question that I get asked a lot is which thread tension I'm using the most. So on your serger, most likely there is an indication showing which thread tension should be used most often. On Brother sergers, you can see the indication showing that most serging should be done from tension 3 to 5, 4 being the middle. And from my personal experience, I've been sewing with this serger for about 2 years. The middle tension, the tension 4, is where about 80% of my entire sewing happens, and it works great with variety of medium weight fabrics, whether it's knit fabrics or woven fabrics. The only times that I do need to adjust the tension is when I'm working with either very lightweight fabrics or very heavyweight fabrics. And even when sewing with very lightweight or very heavyweight fabrics, I am still usually within the 3 and 5 thread tension marking. So my recommendation is to look at your serger, read the manual, and see which thread tension is recommended by the manufacturer. Now let's move on to tip number 3, and it's make a sample seam. Now I have to admit that I personally rarely do the sample seam because, again, in 80% of the times in my serger case, the tension 4 works best. However, if I'm starting to work with fabric that's very lightweight or very heavyweight, I will make a sample to fine-tune that serger tension and to see which tension settings I should be using for that particular fabric. The sample doesn't have to be very big. Small sample is enough. I typically start with all my threads in the tension setting 4, and then if I see a lot of thread, this is an indication again that I need to increase the tension in some thread, or if I see some puckering or some gathering, this is indication that I need to lower the tension in some threads. When you find that tension that works with most fabrics on your serger, you don't have to make the sample every single time, but just remember before sewing very lightweight or very heavyweight fabrics to make a small sample seam and to fine-tune the thread tension on that particular fabric. Now the fourth and final tip is if you tried different thread tension settings, if you tried making the sample seam, if you tried fine-tuning that tension and it still doesn't look right, most likely the issue is not with the thread tension. Now, very often the issue is if the serger is threaded incorrectly, in particularly with the looper threads. So if you're having a hard time finding the setting that makes your seam look good, the next best thing is to look if the serger is threaded correctly. Also, when we're sewing with sergers, there are other points that may need to be adjusted, such as differential feet or the pressure of the presser foot. I talk more about these points in this video, which you may want to watch next. Thank you for joining me today, and I will see you next time. Bye!